Brilliant. Okay, well, first, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you to you all for coming in person or virtually. Also, I couldn't attend in person yesterday, because I had some teaching. And although I listened to much of the talks, I didn't necessarily get all of it. So if at some points you hear me talking and think, gosh, didn't, Catherine say this all much more eloquently yesterday, or didn't Robert make a much more subtle distinction around this yet, or whatever? The answer is probably yes, they did. And I'm just blundering my way back over familiar points. My talk starts, it's in a way based around some issues in what you might think of as applied ethics. But I take it that when people think about applied ethics, they often dislike it. And they dislike it for three reasons. One is that applied ethicists have a tendency to focus on what they call new and emerging technologies, and so to fall into a kind of techno-hype. Second, when people discuss applied ethics, they often take the science for granted, and what they need to do is look at the ethical issues and not interrogate what we actually know. Finally, applied ethicists have a bad habit of throwing around ethical terms and concepts, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, as if it's self-evident what those terms mean. Those are all bad features. My talk today, I'm happy to tell you, has only one of those bad features, okay? I'm going to talk not about a new or emerging technology. I'm going to talk about a technology which is old enough that Venetians in the Middle Ages know this technology, putting a handkerchief over your face to stop you getting the plague. I'm going to talk about how that relates to scientific research we've done, as opposed to taking the science for granted. Unfortunately, I'm also at various points going to have to gesture at ethical principles instead of defining or justifying them properly. So you have two virtues out of three possible virtues. I hope that's okay. So my talk today, like I said, is about face masks. I just want to remind you of something which now feels as if it was a very long time ago. So back in April 2020, as we were all getting used to lockdown, the first lockdown in the UK and so on, there was a question. Should you be wearing face masks? In fact, should face masks be made compulsory wasn't even on the table back then. And we were told by the scientific experts, here's Jonathan Van Tam in a famous press conference, but we do not recommend face masks for general wearing. Now, sometimes this is phrased as an issue around resource allocation issues, worries there weren't enough face masks to go around. But people like Van Tam were very clear. He said, there's no scientific evidence here. There's no reason to give people face masks. A little anecdote about a friend of his in Singapore and so on. So, July 2020, the government says that face masks and coverings are to be made compulsory in England's shops, in pubs, in restaurants, and so on. Yeah. So we have this incredible instance where from April, we go for, the notion of wearing a face mask being poo-pooed, dismissed, to July, it being a legal requirement to wear face masks. What's going on in this case? Well, here's interpretation one. The policy was science-led. Yeah, the government kept on telling us they wanted to engage in science-led policy. And all that has happened here is that the science has changed. Between April and July, we learned more about COVID-19. We learned more about face masks. We gained more evidence. And so, unsurprisingly, if you have science-led policy, when science changes, policy changes. In a way, this is a story of success. But here's the odd thing. Look at newspaper reports on what happened here. People didn't say, well done, government, for changing your policy. Instead, the government was accused of flip-flopping. In fact, the very fact the government changed policy was taken as evidence that the government was chasing a political imperative, not following the science. Second, people in April who were worried about face masks, or people in April who dismissed face masks, typically did so on the basis of one simple fact. They said there are no randomized control trials to show face masks work. Did we have RCTs by July? No. So in a sense, the science didn't change. Now, this is just one episode, okay? In a way, it's this kind of deeply boring, dull episode. But I find it fascinating because we just have two obvious questions which come out of this kind of media coverage, this public response, and this scientific debates. Why do people think that policy changes are evidence that policy wasn't science-led? Yeah, so I just said, if you think policy is science-led, changing policy should be normal. So what's going on here? What is the flip-flop concern? And here's a really obvious question, well, did the science change? Is there a change in the science of face masks or not? Now, in a way, these are two kind of broadly empirical questions. But what I'm hoping to do is in the first part of the talk, I want to try to show you how these broadly empirical questions relate to what I'm going to call this phenomenon that we have this notion of the two faces of science. I think that in political discourse and public debate, we often have two different images of science which are competing against one another at the same time. And that very many debates which appear to be debates about evidence are in fact debates about which virtues scientists should possess. And so specifically, I'm going to say that this kind of these two faces of science, where they differ is in their account of the value and nature of certainty. So in the second part of the talk, I'm going to discuss what I call the ethics of certainty. What's so good about being certain is basically my question here. Section 3, I tried to make some broader philosophical claims about certainty. Those of you who are more interested in the kind of first order issues around the kind of philosophy of science, philosophy of medicine, policy making and so on, will find this less interesting. But I want to try to link what I say here to a larger project for those who are interested. And section 4, I give some very interim conclusions. To be honest, I could have put the words very interim before any one of these sections. This is very much work in progress. So it really is a case where feedback will be much appreciated. So let me start by giving you this general claim I want to set out. I think that we get confused because I think that we often think about science in two very different ways. Here's the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. Yeah, what are they doing at the LHC? They're basically trying to figure out the fundamental building blocks of the universe. What is really important for my purposes about the LHC? What makes the Large Hadron Collider scientific? Those people are what I'm going to call epistemically cautious. Yeah, they don't report a finding until they are 5 sigma certain. Yeah, if you are working at CERN, you could be in a situation where you are, 99.99% certain you have found it. You have got the God particle, and you're not allowed to publish. Yeah, you're not allowed to kind of stick your neck out. Those of you who've done some philosophy of science will know this lovely quote from Van Fraassen. It's not an epistemological principle that one may as well hang for a sheep as for a lamb. It seems to capture this notion that, epistemically speaking, don't go beyond where you have to go. Of course, those of you, again, who know your philosophy of science will know, this is a starting point for Van Fraassen for one way of understanding the empiricist tradition. Yeah, be cautious, be careful. That's what scientists do. That's image 1 of science, face 1 of science. I was going to call it virtue 1 of science, but I was worried that Kasim Kassam would pick me up on epistemic virtues, and I wanted to avoid that particular terminology. Here's the IPCC meetings. So the IPCC, sorry, for those who don't know, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You have the people who produce big climate change reports every 4 to 5 years. How does an IPCC meeting work? How does an IPCC report work? You gather loads of different types of evidence. You have loads of fights over which kinds of evidence to include or exclude. You have lots of debate. You have lots of deliberation. Then you publish a report, and every single claim in an IPCC report, apart from one, climate change is happening, every single report has an epistemic qualifier. We are virtually certain changes to the Earth's climate are due to human action. It is very likely there will be disastrous consequences in the next 100 years. Every single claim has an epistemic qualifier, and if you go to the front of an IPCC report, there's a little table which allows you to translate the qualitative qualifier into quantitative terms. I can't quite remember how it is, but something like virtually certain means 95 to 99% certain, and so on. Yeah? And the IPCC changes its mind all the time. Every 5 years, a new report comes out. Yeah. So think about changes to the estimate of how likely it is the West Antarctic ice sheet will melt. Over reports 4, 5, 6, they have increased their confidence in that very highly. Okay. What's the IPCC doing? The IPCC is what I'm going to call epistemically open. What the IPCC does is it looks like, in some sense, it's the ideal Bayesian agent. It's taking in new evidence, it's updating, it's reporting, it takes in new evidence, updates, reports. Here's all I want to say. Here's my talk in a nutshell. Those two images are different. On one image, the key feature of a scientist is she's cautious, she's careful. She doesn't speak until she's certain. On the second image, the scientist is like some frantic figure who's constantly changing what she says. Why is this important? Think about policy. We say we want scientists to be involved in policy, but I think there are actually two entirely different things we have going on in our heads here. Model one, epistemic caution. If the virtue of science you want to stress is it's cautious, then here's why scientists play a special role in policy. Because whatever they tell you, it's highly unlikely to be false. Yeah? What the scientists give you is the common ground, the thing you can't ignore, the thing you have to pay attention to. Yeah? Now, what it also means is, of course, a scientist is often not telling you stuff which you might want to know. There's a kind of trade-off here, but at least deference to the scientist is a way of ensuring that any claims you put in policy are certain. Whatever else you accept, whatever else you act on, you have to accept what the scientists say. That's one argument for giving scientists a big role in policy. But it's completely different to the argument you might want to give if you stress epistemic openness. Because if your background image of a scientist is this kind of Bayesian updater who's constantly changing, the reason you want her to play a special role in policy is because they're just meant to be people who are giving you the best, unbiased, in some sense, guide to where the evidence is. And what they're doing is that they're just quantifying all sorts of uncertainties for you. And the reason you rely on the scientist is not because she's giving you certainty. She's saying, whatever else you do, you've got to be aware climate change is happening. Instead, she's a person who's guiding you around the world, saying, well, this might be like this, or it might be like that. And most importantly, she's not blinkered in doing this. Those are, I take it, two completely different arguments for why science should play a role in policy. Go back to my face masks example. Why is flip-flopping a problem? I think flip-flopping is a problem for many people. It's not a problem if you hold face 2 as your image of science, yeah? If your image of science is a scientist who's just updating all the time, policy changes. That's good policy making. But if your image of science is that good scientists don't say stuff unless they're certain, then science-based policy should very rarely change. In fact, the very fact that policy does change is evidence policy isn't science-based. Yeah? So here's what I think is going on here. There's a conflict between two images of science. Did the science change? Well, here's what I think is really interesting. I take it that people who stress face 1, science is epistemically cautious, they tended to say that we shouldn't say that face masks work until we are certain. And they also held a particular claim about what is required for certainty, evidence from RCTs. So no, the science didn't change. What you had was an accumulation of more and more evidence, but you didn't, as it were, reach the bar of certainty. Yeah? To reach a bar of certainty, you needed a particular kind of evidence you didn't have. So even if you're building up, you don't get there. That's what I think is going on in these debates. In the background, we have two different images of science. Very quickly, this is Max Weber, who of course warns us against conflating fact and value, science and politics in all sorts of interesting ways. Note that both the accounts I just gave you, how you might think about the relationship between science and politics, are compatible with kind of keeping science and policy separate in various ways. Yeah, it's just a different split. On the first model, the scientist gives you the certain claims which you have to listen to as a policymaker, but then you make value-based decisions about those certain claims. On a second model, it's like a scientist hands you over a pile of claims and you have to decide which to accept or reject based on your values. But neither model breaks down a science policy split. This will be important later. So what? Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this to various people and they're like, oh, Steve, that's kind of interesting, but so what? Good question. I mean, I think the way I've just presented to thinking about stuff might be useful for just understanding some debates. Yeah, we want to understand why certain debates seem to go badly. And I think it might be because we have two images of science which are conflicting in the background. It might be helpful for crafting better interventions. I'll come back to that later. But I take it as philosophers, here's the obvious set of questions we might want to ask. Yeah, well, which face is a face that actual scientists have? Yeah, what is it that scientists are really doing? Are they epistemically cautious or are they epistemically open? Which face ought scientists possess? Yeah, it's a very obvious question. Should scientists always be changing their mind in response to the evidence? Should they be kind of holding to this notion of certainty? Very interesting arguments in social epistemology about things like the value of dogmatism, like feed into this. Can't scientists possess both faces? Every time I've mentioned these ideas, people always say this. Like, why can't scientists be a bit like red and a bit like red? Well, maybe they can. But how do we do this? Is this an individual thing where the scientist herself has both virtues and moves between them? Is it something where the individual has one set of virtues, but then the social interaction generates the second? I don't know. How does this link to other academic arguments? Those of you who know the sociology of science will know what I've described as a split between two faces. Looks a lot like a split between what Funkovitz and Ravitz call normal and post-normal science, and so on. And you might, of course, ask, as philosophers of medicine love to ask, you know, Steve, a lot of that dispute, while it might be in this broader context, seems to revolve around this notion that RCTs were necessary, and are RCTs all that good anyway? Yeah, you might want to say, you know, there's just this epistemic question now. I want to look at the last question, but in an unfamiliar way, because I want to look at the ethics of certainty. So in some really nice, kind of more popular pieces on the COVID-19 pandemic, John Fuller at Pittsburgh has distinguished what he calls two epistemic traditions in recent epidemiology. Okay? One epistemic tradition we're going to call evidence roundheads. These are people who focus on clinical epidemiology. They have a strong focus on the hierarchy of evidence. They like meta-analysis. They want RCTs. Yeah? These are the EBM hardcore. The other hand, I'm going to call the evidence cavaliers. Now, the evidence cavaliers tend to come from a more public health tradition. They're willing to use lots of different types of evidence. They're willing to use models, observational studies, mechanistic evidence. Yeah? Now, again, this is just as it were a high-level sociological distinction between two camps in fights over COVID-19. Now, one thing we might do in these two camps is we might just ask, well, which tradition is right about the relative epistemic value of different sorts of evidence? And of course, a huge amount of work in the philosophy of medicine speaks to those questions. Yeah? Do you need RCTs to get good evidence about interventions? Don't we have cases where observational studies told us smoking causes lung cancer, and so on and so on and so on? Yeah? I'm going to suggest that all of those debates are missing something. What those debates are missing is there's a cross-cutting issue. But you can concede the evidence hierarchy. You can say, yeah, sure, meta-analysis is best. RCTs are really amazing, much better than observational studies. You can concede all the epistemic points, which are epistemic roundheads that EBM people like, but you can deny the implicit assumption they often make, because they often also combine an evidential claim with a practical claim that you should act only when you have RCTs. Yeah? What's going on here? Well, I think we're back to my two faces of science. Yeah? The RCT EBM lot don't just hold a different account of what's good evidence or bad evidence. They are stressing phase one, certainty. You don't act unless you have certainty, plus an account of what gives you certainty. By contrast, the evidence cavaliers will often say explicitly, you know what? Maybe we should act on the basis of this weaker, messier evidence. Yeah, sure, RCTs would be better, but we've got enough evidence. They're stressing phase 2, this kind of openness. We're the best guide to the evidence we have. Let me add one more piece into the mix. This is this tweet from Trish Greenhalgh, who talked yesterday. She says, taking a primum non nocere, which defines here as don't act until we've got RCT certainty. That's not a translation of a Latin note, yeah. Obviously, there's her gloss on this notion of first do no harm, yeah. Her gloss on this kind of precept of ethical medicine is that other people are interpreting it as a claim about RCTs. When hundreds are dying daily, makes no scientific or moral sense. It is neither scientifically nor morally reckless to try out policies that have a plausible chance of working. So I think Greenhalgh is very much in the kind of evidence cavalier tradition, the public health epidemiology tradition. And note what she's doing here. She's not just accusing her opponents of, as it were, having some misguided view of science as being certain. She's linking it in to a moral issue. So here's what we've got. We've got a series of, I feel awful. I feel I don't have an argument so much at this point in my talk. I have what you might call is like two moods, two feelings, yeah? On one hand, we have clinical epidemiology, the EBM kind of tradition, a focus on RCTs, a denigration of other forms of evidence. And I've suggested that this is linked to this virtue of epistemic caution. But also note what it's linked to. It's clinical epidemiology. This tradition comes out of a clinic. It comes out of doctors. It comes out of a tradition which is deeply shaped by a deontic moral norm of non-maleficence, do no harm. Now, think about the public health epidemiologists. They focus on plural forms of evidence. They're willing to allow all sorts of things to come in. They don't just need RCTs, models are fine, observational studies are fine. And I've linked this to the second phase of science, epistemic openness, non-dogmatism. But note what tradition they're coming from as well. Public health traditionally in the UK doesn't have this strong commitment to non-maleficence. It's based in utilitarian moral and political philosophy. You go back to the 19th century, you go back to great public health reformers, those people are coming out of a broadly Benthramite tradition. They're interested in maximizing overall outcomes. And one key feature of maximizing overall outcomes, a lot of people can suffer along the way. You can violate non-maleficence to do that. This isn't an argument. This is, as it were, a suggestion that there's something interesting about this clustering on the two sides. How might we try to take it and take the clustering and make it more specific? Well, here's an argument for certainty. Thinking that the first picture, more or less is right, the clinical epidemiology claim. Assumption one, the scientist's words will guide policy, as a matter of fact. Assumption two, in policy making, it is important to obey a principle of non-maleficence. We understand this clinical mantra, do no harm, as applying to the policy intervention level. Now, non-maleficence is tricky, because first we have non-maleficence under circumstances of certainty. So imagine I know that if I kill Anna, then that will help Betty and Claire. Non-maleficence says, don't kill Anna. Even if, as it were, the net outcome is positive, don't do that. But of course, often we aren't decision-making under certainty, we're decision-making under circumstances of risk. We understand circumstances of risk to mean cases where we have relatively well-defined probabilities. I take it that what non-maleficence means in this case is don't lower Anna's prospects. So what I mean is the probability of harm or benefit. Don't take Anna as it were such that she's now more likely to do badly off than she was before, even if that helps Betty and Claire. I think that's relevant for understanding policies like screening. So in screening, you sometimes know that lots of people will end up being harmed by a screening program. And then that looks like it violates non-maleficence. But what you get around it is by saying, well, look, even if ex post, lots of people are harmed, ex ante, each individual is benefited in terms of prospects. Finally, though, often we're in circumstances where we don't have risk, where we have uncertainty. We don't even know what the risks involved are. And in that case, non-maleficence says, don't take actions unless you are highly certain but no one will be made worse off by those actions. Here is a way of taking the non-maleficence principle and translating it into a claim about about taking action on the basis of evidence. Then, given the scientist's kind of link to policy, she should say an action will have positive consequences in terms of prospects only when she is highly certain this is the case. This is the argument which takes non-maleficence as a guiding principle for policy, and then uses that to give you an account of the scientist's responsibilities. Okay? In speaking. Importantly, in speaking, not in what she herself believes. We can come back to it. But there's an argument against certainty. What's the argument against certainty? Sometimes waiting to be certain about a claim before acting on that claim will be to forego expected overall benefit. Yeah, so imagine we've got some costless intervention. There's an 80% chance it will save 10 lives and a 20% chance it will cost a life. In terms of expected outcomes, it's simple. You're not certain what will happen here, but if you care about maximizing the good, then you should undertake a costless intervention. That's a simple piece of broadly utilitarian reasoning. Assumption 1. In policymaking, we should choose actions which have the best expected overall benefit. Assumption 2, scientists' claims will inform policy. Result, the scientist should not wait for certainty before making claims. She should be handing over all the probabilities to the policymaker to calculate what will have the best consequences. There's lots to fill in these arguments, clearly. But here's a quick non-COVID example. Note something really interesting here. A few years ago, someone said, Steve, there's no point working on communicable diseases because there's no interesting things to say about those anymore. You should work on non-communicable diseases, which turned out to be very bad advice, obviously. So I was doing a project on cancer screening. Many of you will know that breast cancer screening is incredibly controversial because people like the Cochrane collaboration tell you that you don't have evidence that cancer screening will actually do more good than harm. But what's interesting here is people at the Cochrane collaboration will often say, you lack certainty, the intervention will do more good than harm. Assume that's true. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. Now that therefore is really interesting because that therefore suggests some kind of notion that acting and causing harm would be worse than failing to act and allowing harm. Why? Because if you're not certain that cancer screening will do more good than harm, also, it may well be that cancer screening does do more good than harm. There's a sense in which, note, but in the face of uncertainty, the default claim is that then you should go for inaction. Why? I take it because what's lying at the very background here is some notion that, well, benefits foregone aren't relevant. What we really want to do is avoid causing harm. So I think, like I said, this isn't just a COVID thing. I think this goes across lots of public health contexts. This notion that we have different ethical perspectives, the ethical perspectives of the clinic, the broadly deontic focus on do no harm. Do no harm means an important distinction between doing harm and allowing harm. Those kinds of broad concepts, which leads to this focus on the ethics of certainty. You have to be certain about the consequences of your action before acting, which then leads to an account of good science and a good scientist, vice versa on the public health side. You have a kind of utilitarian tradition, which leads you to downplay certainty, which leads you to a different account of good science. That's what I think is going on here. Haven't I just violated the fact-value distinction? So would Max Weber be angry at us? Well, maybe he would. But I take it what's going on here is that when we're thinking about practical sciences, like epidemiology, like the medical sciences, you can still maintain, as it were, some kind of fact-value distinction while holding that, of course, the standards for claims you assert, as opposed to the standards for the evidence you use, are somehow sensitive to the practical uses of knowledge. We can come into that later if people want. Note one final thing, if I'm right here. I think there's a great irony, a lovely irony. Yeah? People who are in favor of evidence-based medicine will often have a self-image. And their self-image, they are rational, they are hard-headed, they are scientific. Yeah? On my account, EBM is really out of kilter with the utilitarian spirit which they often also invoke at the same time. They think of themselves as being the heirs of Jeremy Bentham, but in fact, they're more like Immanuel Kant. Yeah, they're inspired by the starry heavens above them and the moral law within them, not by some cold, hard-headed calculation. Because what they're doing is they're taking the broadly Kantian moral tradition and translating it into a set of epistemic principles. That may be unfair to the EBM people, because you might, because A, it's very quick, but also B, because they might well say, well, look, when we say we're worried about acting without certainty, we're not really appealing to this non-maleficence principle. We're appealing to this kind of inductive argument that in the past, medicine has often got it wrong. So really, we're doing a giant Benthamite calculation. I think that's very suspicious. We can come back to this. So, what next? But again, I think this kind of framework might help us understand some debates, might help us better intervene in some debates. But now we've got an even deeper problem. I told you before we had to think about these two faces of science. Which one do scientists have? Which one ought they have? Can they be combined? If I'm right, now to do all of that, we also have to figure out the fundamental split in moral philosophy and decide if we want to be broadly deontological or broadly consequentialist. That's quite difficult. I don't have much time left. So instead, let's just try to put this in a slightly larger focus and then think about some practical issues. Lying in the background to this talk, lying in the background to lots of this, is the argument from Richard Rudner and Herbert Douglas. Yeah, this is the argument, so-called argument from inductive risk. The argument from inductive risk runs as follows. It says, look, let's imagine that you're testing a machine in a factory and the machine is manufacturing belt buckles. Case one, the belt buckles are being used to hold up people's trousers. Case two, the belt buckles are being used to strap babies into cars. Yeah. Now you're asked to do a series of tests on the machine and then decide if the machine is making effective, well-working belt buckles. Here's a very obvious thing to say. You might well want to test the machine far more rigorously in case two than in case one. Yeah. If in case one you say the machine is working well and it isn't, there's a cost. People's trousers fall down, but it's a minor cost. In case two, if you say the machine is working well when it isn't, there's a cost, babies die in car crashes, and that's a giant cost. Very general claim. You should vary the amount of evidence you demand in support of some hypothesis before accepting the hypothesis in accordance with the costs of different sorts of error. Here's what's weird. In practice in science, we don't do that. In practice, we tend to adopt fixed high standards. Yeah? In practice, scientists, think about it this way. You don't get to write to Nature and say, you know what, I know normally you're like a kind of p-value of 0.05 for this kind of study, but this one's really socially and politically important. Can you just give me p.1, please? You can't do it. We tend to use fixed high standards. Why is that? Well, here's what's interesting. If you look at the literature, there are various ways you can do this. Here's one argument. It's somehow linked to intrinsic value of knowledge. You might think that procedures which minimize false positives, even at the cost of false negatives, somehow map onto various kinds of safety and sensitivity principles. So if you think that knowledge is important in and of itself, epistemic value, so knowledge has epistemic value, there might be some epistemic argument for this. I'm not certain what to say about this kind of argument because I'm not certain why epistemic value should outweigh the practical consequences. We can come back to it. Second kind of argument comes from people like Torsten Wilholt. You might say there's something about trust inside the community. Scientists need fixed standards so they can communicate effectively. Fine. There might be regulatory reasons. So this is what sociologists of science like Ted Porter say. But if you want to use science for regulation, in effect, you need a system which has fixed epistemic standards in it. You might go the argument I sketched earlier. You might think you need fixed high standards so science can provide a kind of common ground for political debate. Because in this way, as it were, the scientist avoids value judgments. She just always uses the same standards. Here's a lovely example. I don't know anyone who actually holds this, but it was suggested to me by Polly Mitchell, who's here at KCL, just over drinks once. You might think it's just resource allocation. It's just really hard for humans to consider all the possibilities. So only considering the ones which are highly certain is a kind of filtering mechanism. Some people, our friends over at the LSE, like to think about this in terms of ambiguity aversion. They just think humans just much prefer certainty to uncertainty, and you see this experimentally in things like Elias's paradox. This makes it seem like we have a taste for certainty, the same way we have a taste for ice cream or something. Or, this is what I've suggested, you can think of certainty, the search for certain principles in science, or the emphasis on high epistemic standards in science as operationalizing the do no harm principle. That's what I've just tried to suggest today. So here's what I think is interesting. When we have these debates, it's very often the case that you'll find people who are insisting that what you have, that the claims a scientist makes, the claims which enter policy, must be claims which are highly certain. They might be operationalized by something like an only use RCTs principle. And of course, we can attack the second part on epistemic grounds. But I'm interested in the first part. Why focus so heavily on certainty? Why not say, well, look, the claims aren't certain, but they're good enough. And I take it that what this long table is trying to get across to you is that people like me, people who are enemies of certainty, we face a real uphill battle. We face an uphill battle because there's kind of an overlapping consensus on the value of certainty, as it were. Yeah, many different arguments, many different traditions lead you towards thinking, well, isn't it obvious that face one is the correct face of science? What argument 7 adds is this kind of deontic twist, perhaps, to the other arguments which are more consequentialist in spirit. Okay. I'm sorry, this has been a very kind of general overview of a way of thinking about some of these debates about face masks. Let me just give some very interim conclusions. Let's say we wanted to argue for phase 2. Let's say we wanted to say, no, we don't need certainty. It's true, RCTs showing face masks work would give us certainty. It's true, our evidence doesn't get us anywhere near certainty. But, you know, your emphasis on certainty is misguided. How might we argue for that? Well, on the account I've given, here's one option. You could just try to deny the doing-allowing distinction which lies at the heart of a non-maleficence principle. Remember, the non-maleficence principle says first do no harm. What gives that bite is do no harm, even if that involves foregoing benefit. Yeah, I don't get to kind of, you know, kill Elseline, even if doing that saves 2 lives. So the doing-allowing distinction is, I take it actually non-maleficence is just a way of operationalizing doing-allowing at an even deeper level. You could deny the doing-allowing distinction. Lots of philosophers do that. But I think good luck to you. Yeah. I mean, I think the doing-allowing distinction is a distinction by which we live our lives. And it's very hard to know what to do about it. And Emma says it's calling me. I'll call you back later, Emma. I don't know. Shall I maybe reject the call? I think that, yeah. So I don't think, I mean, I think going by it as sort of a fundamental, you know, really fundamental route isn't going to work here. Here's a second, perhaps easier way to do it. Everything I've said implies, like everything I've said trying to reconstruct the EBM argument, implies that the doing-allowing distinction should guide clinical decision-making and is somehow applicable to policy contexts. But here's what you might think. You might think, well, those kind of principles of clinical ethics, principles like do no harm, they apply inside the clinic, but they don't apply at Whitehall, as it were, you know? It's like utilitarianism for public health policy, even if deontology in the clinic. Many of you will know Bob Gooden's really nice book where he basically argues for a version of his play. I think this is a very popular move, but I'm just not certain it's a move which captures the reality of how decisions are made. So I'm very interested in the recent JCVI decision on the vaccination of school children. Yesterday, Trish gave a quite skeptical reading of that decision, but I think there's a way of reconstructing the reasoning which is really interesting. The JCVI just say, look, it's true, vaccinating kids might be good for the rest of the community, but it's bad for the kids, yeah? As it were, the risk to the children outweighs the benefit to the children. And so, on my account of do no harm under risk, it violates non-maleficence. So we can't vaccinate the school children, even if that would stop the pandemic faster. And I take it that you've seen this kind of decision, these kinds of decisions quite a lot around vaccination, where they're structured by this weird mixture of a population focus plus a non-maleficence baseline. Yeah? You might go back, those of you who are British, to the JCVI's decision not to give the AstraZeneca vaccine to the under 30s. If you're a utilitarian, let's be honest, who cares? Yeah, got so few cases in return for expected benefit. What's driving the decision, I take it, is some broadly non-maleficence concern. So I think your best bet is to just argue that, sure, non-maleficence is important, but so too are other moral principles. So too are principles about maximizing the good, doing good in the world, public health, and so on. And those principles would lead us towards a more relaxed attitude towards certainty. I take it that's a strategy we're going to have to do. I don't quite know how to fill it out. Second, there's a practical, important kind of implication of what I've said. Here is a really common argument I've heard and seen lots of times. People trust science, but they misunderstand what scientists do, and that leads to a few confusions. Yeah? Therefore, we just need to teach people what scientists really do. So the person who's a big defender of this argument is Patrick Vallance. So apparently Vallance, has recently said, look, in the pandemic, it became very clear that people were willing to trust scientists, but they had this idea that scientists could provide certainty. So when we scientists changed our mind, they got a bit confused. And so now the government is very keen to explain to people that what scientists really do is very often they change their mind. And there seems to be some thought here that trust in science is this constant. Yeah? The public will trust science, they just need to be told what the actual mechanism is underlying science. But on my account, that's kind of a really bad idea. Yeah? Because on my account, if you trust science because you believe science gives you certainty, and then someone comes along and tells you, we scientists, we don't have a clue, then it's not as if you say, oh, I still trust you. Yeah? Think about an analogy. Imagine somebody says, do you trust your GP? You say, yeah, I trust my GP. And they say, why do you trust her? You say, well, she just seems to have this intuitive sense. When I go to visit her, she can just tell what's wrong with me, and she always gets it right. Yeah? And then, your GP says, you know what? Actually, I don't do that at all. I just look it up on Google. It's not as if suddenly you're like, oh, but I still trust you. Just now I have a different mechanism in place. Yeah? You might well lose trust. And I take it that this is exactly what's going on here. I take it that when we are in this interesting situation where many people trust science because they believe science deals in certainty, turning around and saying, hey, everyone, let me explain. Science is full of uncertainty is not a way of keeping the trust, but making it a bit more well-grounded. I think it's just as likely to be a way of destroying trust. And that's my very depressing conclusion. Thank you very much.